Okay, I think it's 1:30, and so I think it's time to get started. Are you here for the micro class?
Yeah.
Okay, have a seat. So we're going to get started. It's 1:30, and for those of you who are watching on video, you'll be able to access the link to this. I wanted to make a few announcements before we are you here for the micro course?
No, I already swept this room at about 11:45. I can't speak.
Okay, that's fine.
So it's good.
Yeah, we should be good. Yeah, we should be good. Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry about that. That's a little bit of cleaning, house cleaning issues there. So, so I will. A couple things I wanted to make as sort of an announcement here. The video links to this, if you would choose, if you would rather watch this at home at some point, the link to the videos. I try to post these the same day. It doesn't always happen, but I usually come in sometime. I try to do it right after class, but there's a class that comes in this room here at Maxell's right after I meet, after we meet, and so I don't usually have time to do it because I've got to compress the file and upload and all that. It'll usually be to YouTube. It sometimes may be to a Zoom file, but it'll be available, and you can click on it. But just by going to works in Brightspace, go to Work Center, Content, and then on the left it has the week, and then it'll have the links to this. And it should be easily accessible without a password. If there is a password, it's something I'm not aware of, so let me know if that does come up as a password. I usually also try to send the invitation to this particular class about 10 or 15 minutes before. This is a recurring web link though, so this should not be a problem. You should be able to maybe save it in your favorites or whatever, so you should be able to easily access this. If you cannot access it for whatever reason, either live or on the replay, let me know, and I'll try to work something out to accommodate you. Also, I know it looks like I'm not really looking at you because this camera's up kind of high up on the ceiling there, so kind of bear with me. But I tried to tighten it on just this one board here. So hopefully that is viewable, and hopefully you can hear me okay. One other thing I mentioned, well, a couple things. The PowerPoint slides are usually the way that I sort of organize the presentation. I know over time people have sort of viewed those as being maybe a little bit more important than what they are in terms of study guides for the exams. Certainly you can use them. They're available and they're good. It's all good information. But you know, it's really just a sort of way to help you follow along as we're doing it, as we're going. Now, I haven't posted this week's yet, mostly because I've still got an issue with the sort of the double vision that we're seeing on the PowerPoints from last week. I'm sort of back and forth with distance learning on this, and there was an error in miscommunication or something because they thought that I had duplicate files, and I'm trying to explain to them it's not duplicate files, it's duplicate images within each slide. So as of yesterday, I haven't heard back from them. They usually are pretty quick at getting back to me. Could be that they're researching it. There are occasionally some weird things that do pop up with Brightspace. This is one I've never seen before. So when that's resolved, I'll post it. And so you'll have those available to download or just to simply view, whichever you prefer. Also, I included in this week a checklist. And let me see something here. Okay. I also included a checklist for those of you who like checklists. So you can print it off and just make a check as to what's going on. Because I know a lot of people will call me or email me, say, hey, what am I supposed to do this week? And even though it's in the syllabus and whatnot, and it's in the module, sometimes it's good just to have it there. You can check off what we're doing. So in this case, we're just reading and following along and viewing the videos if you would like to view the videos. Okay. Okay, so that's that. And then one final thing, and I wanted to mention this in case you missed last Wednesday's discussion. I think it was Wednesday that I talked about this, but I know that there were questions that students had about the exams. I know when this format of class was first developed, it's called Attend Anywhere, that the idea was that it's really a basically on-campus class held between 1:30 and 2:45, Monday, Wednesday, in Maxell's or 4:15 on main campus. But you can also watch from home on Zoom link, or you can watch the video recording at some point. But the exams were to be taken on campus, either in class at the given time or in a testing center. And so I decided last week that we would simply make those available as well. You could take them in class, you could take them in one of the testing centers, or you can take it online. And I suspect probably a lot of people will want to do it online. So that'll be available. And our first exam is not set until week 4. We're at the end of week 2 right now. So we've got some time. And I'll give you more details as we get closer to the exam as to what the format will look like. This was not my original plan. My original plan was to go with what the school had initially designed the class to be. That was mostly a class where it was held at regular time, so people could show up at the regular time. Because it was discovered that a lot of students really didn't like online learning all that much. We discovered that during the pandemic, a lot of people did not like, just having to do things on the computer, that they kind of liked being in front of a professor and whatnot. So, which I sort of get. So this way, we've got all 3 options covered. You can do it all online, you can do it all in class, or you can do it virtually, what we call asynchronously. That is, you can watch the classes at some time at your leisure. We do ask that you do it during the same week, however, so that you can record your attendance on the attendance link, which is found by going into Brightspace. And this is all of my announcement from yesterday. Go into Brightspace, the main course page, coursework, discussions, and then there's a week 2 attendance link. And just, you don't have to give a lot of details. I looked at the videos, whatever. And that's the way you record your attendance. We are required to capture attendance. That's just a requirement from the Department of Education. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything so far? Okay. So I like to start my classes just by sort of giving a bit of a update as to where we stand, as to where things are. So on week 2, obviously the Martin Luther King holiday was Monday, so we didn't have class, and so there are no class activities. And everything went up yesterday, which was Tuesday's the first day of the class week. So we've got sort of an abbreviated week. So we may be just a little bit behind, but I don't think we'll get all the way through chapter 2 today, just given where how long these courses, this material usually takes to get through. I do want to cover just the remaining bit of the appendix A from last time, or some of the content that relates to some of the chapter A material. I don't want to spend more than just a few minutes on that, so bear with me if you feel like that's a bit repetitious for you. As I mentioned last week, we're sort of weaving in and out of some of the topics for chapters 1 and 2, which are pretty introductory to a lot of econ textbooks, and so we've used various textbooks over the years. This happens to be the online version, the free online version, which we made available just because it saves people money. The cost for textbooks was absolutely getting to be crazy, so we decided to go with the OpenStax version. So, but some of the material I think just kind of flows better the way I sort of presented here. And then once that we figure out the PowerPoint issue, I'll get those updated as well. What we don't get done in chapter 2, I'll cover next week. 24th is Monday. And chapter 3 is demand and supply. It's a pretty important chapter, particularly for micro. It's really the beginning of our first microeconomic modeling of markets. And we'll cover that. And then I think we've got chapter 4 to cover at some point. And I don't know, I think maybe I should probably make a note here. We probably will get into chapter 4 a little bit next week, I think. Put a little question mark. And what we don't get done for chapter 4, we still plan to have our first exam in week 4. So that shouldn't be any issue. We did lose a day, but no big deal. We should be fine. Okay. All right, so questions for that for me, okay? And if you do, I can hear you, unless you're muted, of course, but I can certainly hear you, and hopefully you can hear me. It's not a problem if you do have questions. We're always a small enough group. We had a really big group yesterday for one of my classes, and that was kind of good to see. And usually people mute themselves, and that's kind of good too. Sometimes when that's not the case, we have a little bit of noise, but it's not too bad. So. Okay, so what do I want to do? I want to cover the rest of chapter or appendix A, which was sort of a math piece, and it really dealt with some of the issues which confront students in economics from a mathematical perspective, and that is what are the outer edges of what we need to be exploring when it comes to dealing with mathematical problems as they relate to econ. So I think last time we talked about this idea of the Cartesian plane, and we had the first, second, third, fourth quadrants. And I said that one of the things about that we'll be dealing with in economics is all of our graphing is going to be done in the first quadrant. So that's kind of good there. It's going to be positive values. against positive values, so along either the X or the Y axis. One of the things in economics that we'll be dealing with is, and we'll get to this more next week, is that we tend to plot things of a dollar figure on the vertical axis. There are exceptions, and we'll see some exceptions to that, and things of a numerical nature on the horizontal or x-axis. And then what's the reason for that? There's no particular reason. In fact, from a mathematician's perspective, I think these probably should be inverted, particularly given the idea of dependency. Because if you have the y variable, when we have some kind of function of y is a function of x, right? We usually refer to the y value as a dependent variable. That is, as we mentioned last time, that y is the scoreboard. It doesn't do anything. It depends on the activities of x, which is the independent variable, or variables. There could be numerous of those. Independent. It's hard sometimes when you're right upon this on the board here. Independent variable or variables. So that would be the football players on the field who go and score the touchdown, and then the y reflects that. But it's not the case where y goes up by 6 points, and then somebody discovers that now they have to run and score a touchdown. It's the other way around. These independent variables, and by the way, you could have any kind of arrangement like this: ax squared plus bx plus c. That's the quadratic equation. We can have multiple numbers of x's. Okay, so it doesn't really make any difference. All these could be independent variables. Okay, all these are independent. And in other words, what can we say about independent variables that's important is that they're subject to control. Or maybe from a microeconomic perspective, one word that might be a little bit more relevant is management, subject to management, subject to control, subject to management. So, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't always understand, is because of the fact that I think that they are looking to manage the dependent variable, but the dependent variable is the scoreboard. What you're really trying to manage is the independent variables in order to get the result, which is the dependent variable. So what was the example I gave last time? When we said if y is a function of x, as y does what x intends for it to do, what if y is wages, right? So wages earned, and again, that's a dollar figure, so that would be plotted on the vertical axis, right? And as a function of x, and x is hours worked. And hours worked is a number, right? It's a numerical value. So if the goal is to earn more money, right? To earn higher wage or earn more money, then one can manage working more hours. Not just simply saying, okay, I want to make more money. How do you do it? What's the variable under your control? To the extent that it's under your control, is to work more hours. So that's the control variable there. And we mentioned last time as well, this is really sort of the last point I'll get to with regard to this. And that is, if you take some sort of point A here and some sort of point B here, and these then translate to some sort of ordered pair arrangement, where you got some x1, y1, and x1, y1 is simply the ordered pair, the coordinate pairs for this particular point, point A. And this then would correspond to some x2, y2, right? Hopefully this is not anything but review for you. X2, y2. Then something has changed with regard to whatever that observation is. And if you can connect the two by a straight line, remember any 2 points in two-dimensional space can be connected by a straight line. And so we have a linear equation of it. We got to this point last time, I believe. And I'm going to go ahead and erase this just because I've got some limited board space here. But it takes all of these linear equations, take the generic form of y equals mx plus b, where the y value, one y value is associated with one x value. The b is the y crossover or the intercept. If there is one, if there isn't, then it's just 0. And the n value is the slope. And slope is basically rate of change. This is really, really important in economics. It comes up again and again and again. That is the idea of the slope of a linear function. And a lot of the operations we'll be dealing with, or a lot of the graphs you'll be dealing with, we'll be looking at linear equations, but linear functions, which have slopes. And so in this particular case, we talk about slope. I think we've all sort of seen this particular idea before. If m is the slope of a function, then what is m? It's the rise over the run. And what is the rise over the run? It's simply the change in the vertical over the change in the horizontal, or delta y over delta x, the little triangle, which is the delta symbol for change, which is used pretty much everywhere in the social sciences or in the mathematics, well, in all the sciences, not social sciences, it's physical sciences, whatever. And we're not going to do a lot of the Greek symbols here. If you want to take further econ or finance, the finance department loves, finance professors love Greek symbols and get into Omicron and all that. But we're not going to be dealing that extensively with it, other than to talk about the idea of the change in one thing in relation to the change in something else. But it's very simple, and it's simply this: it's new minus old, always, always, always. So y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, and that will give you the actual slope of of this particular line. And if we were just to sort of make up numbers here, I'm just going to sort of make up numbers. I don't know what these are any more than the graphs does. Doesn't really make any difference. So let's go with 15 and 30. Okay. Then let's compute the slope of this particular line, given the fact that we've got the values for x1, x2, y1, y2. So it's just a matter of plugging these in here in order to arrive at the slope of this particular line. So let's take x2 minus x1. x2 minus x1 is 40 minus 15. All over y2 minus y1, which is 30 minus 15. So what do we end up with? We have 25 over 15. Which is 1.67, I think, right? 1 2/3, 1.67. And what is missing from this, but it's always implied, is a positive sign. And obviously, we don't need the explanation. If it were negative, it would be shown. But if it's just understood to be a regular value, it's a non-zero positive value. It's the positive sign is understood. But here's the thing to understand about positive slopes. Okay. And that is this. So I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this. And the good thing about the videos is the fact that if there's something you missed, you can always go back and rewind and whatever. If you've got positive slopes, okay, a positively sloped linear function. Okay. And by linear, we simply mean straight line, right? Oops, linear function. What it expresses is a direct relationship between x and y, or between two variables, let's say. Direct relationship between the two variables. Okay, between the two variables. The two variables are x and y. My handwriting is really bad today. Jeez, I don't know what's gotten into me. Between the two variables of x and y. And so what this really means is this: that is, they go in the same direction. So if x goes up, y also goes up. If x goes down, y then goes down. Okay? And that's essentially what's going on with regard to an upward sloping curve. Or in this case, it's a line, a straight line is simply a kind of a curve. And so if it's positively sloped, we know that there's a direct relationship between the two variables. And by the way, we'll deal with a lot of curves in the class, probably beginning next week. And how do you determine the slope of a curve? Well, you determine the slope at a particular point, and that point and the slope of that function at that particular point is the slope of the tangent line, which is a straight line, which is computed this way here. Okay. There's an easier way to do it using calculus, but again, calculus is not required for this course, and so that would not be part of the equation. Okay. So positively sloped linear function, a direct relationship between the two variables, x and y. On the other hand, what if you had something different here? What if you had, let's say we had something like 10 minus 15, right? And then we end up with a whole different set of values. And obviously that wouldn't correspond to this graph. I'm just simply plugging numbers here. Then we end up with -5 over 15, which is -1/3, which is the same as -0.33. I kind of like to use the decimals as opposed to fractions. Fractions are easy to work with, and we'll certainly be working with fractions in computing slopes and in computing values that we'll call elasticities. Those will be coming up, I believe, in chapter 5. But I like students to get comfortable with the idea of 1/3 being 0.33 in this case, negative 1/3 being negative 0.33. Mostly because it sort of better matches the input and output of calculators and computers. And computers tend not to spit things out in terms of fractions and tend not to really like fractions that much as inputs. They go better as inputs than they do outputs, but nonetheless, I think just to get comfortable with it. If somebody says a quarter, you can say it's 0.25. Okay. So what about this? We have a negative sign here. We have a negative slope on it. So what does that mean? We have a negatively sloped linear function, right? A negatively sloped linear function. And so what we're saying here, there's an inverse relationship between the two variables. An inverse relationship here. Okay, so and the two variables again are x and y. So what does that mean here? It basically means this. It means that if x goes up, y goes down. If x goes down, y goes up. That's what an inverse relationship is. And that will be expressed not as a upward sloping curve, but as a downward sloping curve. So it would look something like this. That would be a downward sloping curve, or in this case, a straight line. So negatively sloped linear function, FN simply is the abbreviation for function. Negatively sloped linear function is an inverse relationship between the two variables. Inverse or opposite, whichever you prefer. Inverse, negative, opposite, all they say the same thing. If one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. If one thing goes down, the other thing goes up. They're inversely related. And this would be, so to take the example of hours worked and wages, you could have an inverse relationship between hours worked and leisure time, for instance, right? So the more hours you work gives you fewer leisure hours, right? So if the two relationships here are hours worked and leisure time, the more hours you work, the less leisure time you have. The fewer hours you work, the more leisure time. So as a result, that's an inverse relationship, okay, between those two values. Or maybe you could even say something like, the more hours that I work at job A means the less time I have to work at job B. So as a result, there's an inverse relationship between hours at job A and hours at job B. Okay, so there are all kinds of inverse relationships we see all the way through economics. In very many instances, we'll see this. And this idea of positive slopes and linear slopes do make a lot of difference, because a lot of what we do in micro is to study the rate of change in one thing in relation to the change in another thing. And we'll be looking at the magnitude of that change. It's one thing to say, okay, this is inversely sloped, but how much inversely sloped is it? In other words, how sensitive is it, one variable to another? Realizing, of course, that we run into a problem in economics and everywhere that deals with math as a scientific tool, and that is the fallacy of causation. The fallacy of causation says that two things might go in the same direction or in the opposite direction, and it might happen on an instance. And we might say, aha, one thing caused the other thing to happen. When in fact, one thing may not have anything to do with the other thing, it's just a coincidence. And this is what we have to sort of tease out a lot of times is, does one thing happen because of the other thing, or is it something else? In economics right now, in the labor market right now, we're hearing lots and lots of stories about the fact that employers can't hire workers. So they're wondering, is the causation for this all the stimulus that the government's been providing, both in terms of extended unemployment benefits, extended Medicaid, extended child tax credit, or which was, I guess, the advanced child tax credit, which therefore provided a disincentive for workers to go back into the workforce. And so is that the reason for it? Because we've heard story after story from employers who have at least convinced themselves, I'm not saying they're wrong, I mean, I'm more akin to thinking that they have a point, but do they know for sure? And I think there's some skepticism. I know the Federal Reserve Chairman is doubtful about that, is doubtful as to why people really have not returned to the workforce who could have. In other words, what we call labor force participation is not where it might be, because there are people who are just not going back into the labor force. And why is that? And of course, a lot of employers, again, think that there's the causation is because of the fact that there's so much stimulus that people don't feel like they need to go back, particularly given the risks, health risks that are out there, et cetera. So anyway, you get the idea as to what, they may be wrong. And it turns out that in a few years, we determined that is a wrong conclusion that we don't know what that may be something else. So we'll find out. I mean, it could just simply be concern over the virus. That could very well be what's happening. And I guess time will tell. I do believe we're going to learn a lot about public health and the economics of public health through this crisis. And I don't see it ending anytime soon. Unfortunately, I can't believe we're entering the third year of this, but we are. So it is what it is, and I guess we just have to deal with it. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything so far? That does it for the math piece. Thanks for bearing with me here, particularly if you think, okay, I've seen this, you know, got it, check, you know, but I think a lot of people just sort of want to be, you know, if anything, it's a jump start, it's a refresher as to some of this stuff, because with math, it's a case of use it or lose it, really. I firmly believe that. I was at a seminar with some economists not too long ago, and I guess about a year ago, and a guy was showing us some fancy math and all that, and one of the guys next to me, who's a longtime econ professor at UNM, said, gosh, I had to really think about this because I haven't seen some of these functions in a while. So if you haven't worked with it, you know, if that's not your particular bailiwick, then it's you use it or lose it, I think. And so it's sometimes good to kind of get back into the groove of things. Okay. All right. So I want to go on and just pick up some pieces from where we left off last time. We were talking a bit about, well, we went through the circular flow model. And in this, when I talk about the introductory piece to econ, what I'm really saying is that I am just sort of covering some of the foundational material, some of the groundwork that allows us then to really get into things like model building and theory and really understanding how markets work. And microeconomics is, as I mentioned last week, the study of markets is probably the best definition of what micro is. And so for us to really truly get into it, we need to sort of lay some of this groundwork. And so I'm going to be covering some bits and pieces of this. And we began building our first model last time. That was the circular flow model. And the circular flow model basically talked about the who's, economic actors. We talked about households, firms, and government. Those are the three main actor groups. And we collectively joined households and firms, business firms together as the private sector, because they tend to make decisions privately and in their own self-interest. But that sort of covered the who. We're going to cover a little bit more of the what today. And so if this foundational material falls along the lines of the who, what, when, where, why, then I think what we're doing here is covering some of the whats. And so I want to talk a bit about goods and services. And remember, one of the flows with the red arrow last time was goods. And one of the most fundamental transfers of value in economics is firms producing goods and transferring them to households. What about goods? We said that goods was going to be, we use the term goods as a euphemism for goods and services. But having said that, though, I do want to sort of break apart a little bit the idea of goods and services, just so that we understand there is a distinction. And it's not a huge distinction, as we'll see a bit later, but I think it's one that we should talk about. And that is, we talk about goods, we're being very specific about goods as goods. We're talking about goods which have a physical nature. They have a physical nature. They can be, you know, picked up and dropped on your foot. That was spelled physical. I don't know what's wrong with my handwriting today. Physical. I think I need more coffee. Physical nature. So they have a physical substance to them. So toasters and bottles of Coke and sweaters and raincoats and shoes, all of those have a physical nature. And so they can be shipped around. They can be put on a shelf. They can be moved around. They can be stolen, burned up in a fire, all that sort of thing. In other words, they can be inventoried. They can be inventoried. And we're going to talk a bit more about inventories a little bit later as we get going in the class. Okay, so they can be inventoried. Inventory basically means they can be counted, put on a shelf, moved around, all that, and which you really can't do with services necessarily. And then one thing about goods is there tends to be a lag time. Not always, there tends to be a lag time. A lag meaning just simply a time difference between production and consumption. Sometimes this lag time can be very long indeed. Production could be, you know, in one particular year, even the consumption could be a year or two, several years down the road. I mentioned in my class yesterday that I grew up in a house that was built in 1904, and it's still standing. I'm not living there anymore, but it's still standing. So it was produced in 1904. Everybody who was involved in it, I am assuming, is long gone. But somebody's still consuming the value of that good. So it's obviously has a physical nature. It's a house. And realtors will talk about inventories of houses. And so that you kind of get the idea that any kind of physical structure that is available on the market could be inventory. This differs from services in the sense that they tend to have a non-physical nature. And that whatever the physical attributes are of the good in question, it's mostly incidental and irrelevant. So if I go to get a haircut, I pay my barber $20 or whatever. And yeah, it may be obvious I got a haircut. It may not be obvious, but I didn't go there necessarily for the physical aspects. I went there because he was able to do something for me and something I couldn't do myself. Or what is probably a better example is I go to an attorney to have a will drawn up and I pay the attorney $1,000. The evidence that I've been there is I get copies of a will, but I didn't pay the attorney $1,000 for pieces of paper. I went there to have a will drawn up, and that was the service that I was paying for. And one thing about services is that they tend not to be inventoried. And there are some exceptions to this, one exception being things like research, where research can be done and there's no physical substance to it, it's just intellectual property. And then years and years later, somebody does something with the research and makes it work. The example that I used in my other class earlier was that of research into stealth technology for military aircraft. That research began right after World War II in the 1940s. And the development of this didn't get going until the 1970s. And I don't believe we even began seeing these aircraft until sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. And so as a result, there could be a lag time. That's one exception. For the most part, these services are not inventory. They're not put on a shelf. I can't say to my doctor, go ahead and get started with that physical exam. I'll pick that physical exam up later. It doesn't work that way, obviously. Okay, so they're not inventory. And that there tends to be produced and consumed at the same time, with some exceptions. But for the most part, if I go to the doctor, my doctor sees me at the same time that I am there. So my doctor is producing the services while I'm consuming them at the same time. And the same goes with a lot of particular services like that. Okay, there are some exceptions. Motion pictures and whatnot can be inventoried and whatnot. We don't really consider those goods. But for the most part, we're talking about services as being that. Okay. So having mentioned all this, just so that we're clear that there are distinctions we ought to make, we're still going to use the term goods as a euphemism for goods and services, which is what I mentioned on last Wednesday, in class last Wednesday. But I do want to recognize the fact that there are differences between these goods, and that one of the things that may be a shortcoming in some econ textbooks is that often the examples that are given of production of something is of a physical nature. That is, Maria makes 10 pizzas or whatever, or John bakes 20 cakes, right? Those are all physical goods that could be, inventoried and whatnot. But whereas we often don't see the fact that, Robert has, produced 10 tax returns or whatever. So it's a little bit of a different sort of thing. We tend to focus on the physical nature, but I think it's one that is easily apprehensible to a lot of us that we can look at and see what's going on. One thing I should mention also, and I'll move on to my next sort of, having said that we will use the term goods as a euphemism for both goods and services. The idea of services are growing much faster in our economy than our goods production, which sometimes leads people to say, incorrectly I might add, that we don't make anything anymore in America, which is not really true. I mean, I know where the idea comes from that, that we don't make cars anywhere near the extent that what used to be made in the United States. And a lot of industries have simply gone elsewhere. The textile industry, we really don't make almost any apparel anymore in our society. Some that is made is mostly high-end designer material or of a very small manufacturing nature. So it's true that there are industries that have been lost, but instead, I think what our economy is producing from a physical standpoint are more high-value outputs like computer technology and networking and telecom. I mean, all that sort of thing that and healthcare products and medical devices, those sorts of things, and jet aircraft. So we do make things, we're just making different things, and that more developing nations are producing some of the lower value output, like apparel, shoes, and socks, and housewares, and things like that. So, okay, and services are growing quite rapidly. So anyway, those are the distinctions. I don't really want to dwell on the distinctions very much, because what I really want to do is talk about types of goods, because this is going to come up as being important, particularly as we measure the market response to different phenomena, like change in price, and how much people will choose to buy a good if the good price changes, or how much people will choose to buy some other good if the price of some other good changes, or how much people respond to changes in income and that sort of thing. So anyway, let's talk about types of goods here. Talk about types of goods. And when we talk about types of goods, we are going to start a sort of a list that we'll be adding on to a bit later as we get toward the very end of the semester. And that is, we're going to be presenting goods in what are known as dichotomous pairs. And what that is simply a way of viewing things by looking at one thing and its opposite. Sometimes you can define something better by what it's not, and then what it's not then helps to further clarify what the thing in question is. And so dichotomous goods are basically all around us. And in fact, dichotomous relationships all around us. You could be one thing or not the other. You could be male or female, but generally not both at the same time, right? Or you could be over 65 years old or under 65 years old of age, but not both. You can be a smoker or a non-smoker, but generally not both. So, which doesn't fence you in, though, from being a female non-smoker or a male smoker, right? So we'll get to that concept a bit later. So dichotomous pairs are arrangements of goods, in this case, by their opposites. The first set of opposites we'll talk about are substitutes and complements. Substitutes and complements. And we'll give some examples of these just to show you the strength of these pairing relationships. So substitutes are not particularly difficult for us to grasp. That is goods which we swap for other goods in a purchase decision. They can be swapped for other goods. Now, some of this would be encapsulated on the PowerPoints, but since we don't have those available, I'll just go ahead and write it for you. Swap for other goods in a purchase decision. And oftentimes, the deciding factor is price. Oftentimes, it's a price decision. So, for instance, if I find a pair of gloves that I think is too expensive, maybe I'll buy a different pair of gloves because of the price difference. But in doing that, though, I have to be careful here to consider the fact that there are really two different kinds. And I want to be clear that, because a lot of times people will say, if I ask for an example, somebody will say Coke and Pepsi, or Sprite and 7-Up, or a Whopper or a quarter pounder with cheese, right? Something like that. These are not perfect substitutes, but they are what we would call brand substitutes. Goods that are fairly similar to one another, but they differ in terms of brand. And in fact, Coke and Pepsi are pretty close to being the same good as are 7-Up and Sprite. I know that it takes people, it's a very discerning palate that can distinguish the difference. And in fact, there have been studies that have been done that show that people really can't tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi. If only have 2 Dixie cups and they test them. Everyone thinks, oh, I can do it, and they really could not. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, somebody, our professor had a study where they took 2 beers, Miller Lite and Bud Light. And of course, a lot of people thought that they could determine the difference, but they could not, believe it or not. That they were right about 50% of the time, which is basically random. So brand substitutes oftentimes dealing with price. So Coke is expensive relative to Pepsi. Somebody is likely to buy Pepsi. Okay. So, and by the way, the competition between Coke and Pepsi at times has been very, very intense. There was something called the Cola Wars of the 80s, which we may talk a bit about a bit later. We talk about price competition, but brand substitutes are that. What is probably more compelling from a economic standpoint and a marketing standpoint is non-brand substitutes. And these are goods which aren't even the same good at all, but again, are swapped out for another. because of price. And so maybe chicken might be a substitute for pork, or green beans for peas, or corn for potatoes, or hamburgers for hot dogs, whatever the case might be. Okay, so if beef is expensive, and so people say, I'm not going to buy ground beef, I'm going to buy hot dogs instead, then a hot dog is not the same good as a hamburger, and so as a result, it's a non-brand substitute. It's not even a branding decision, it's the fact that these are two different goods altogether. Okay. So as a result, oftentimes price is the determining factor with regard to substitute goods. And we're going to be talking a bit about substitutes a bit later when we talk about how people make their allocation decisions. I know in this chapter, chapter 2, I kind of think there's a bit of, I think they've kind of moved up the discussion about this idea of the budget line and people's optimal consumption choices. I think that I would rather talk about that a bit later. Once we get a little bit more deeply into the idea of substitutes and complements, I think it goes better a bit later. But you can read that, certainly. There's nothing wrong with reading. You can go ahead and do that now. So good can be a substitute for another good, but it can also be a complement. And a complement are goods which are produced, goods which are consumed together. I should make this clear, goods which are purchased and or consumed together. Okay, so what does that mean? There are two different elements of this. They're purchased and or consumed together because of the fact of what? Number one good may be a component of another good. One good may be a component of another good. So for instance, think about something like this. If we're buying CDs, for instance, we're also buying CD cases. CD cases are part of the good itself. Or if we're buying anything made of plastic, for instance, plastic is a component of so many goods. And so as a result, we buy a hairbrush that's made of plastic. Not only are we buying the hairbrush itself, but we're also consuming plastic, which obviously goes backwards in the chain of production, but it becomes part of the good itself. But what we'll be focusing more on is the fact that that these goods are consumed together because they simply go together. Their use makes sense. Their use is logical. The use together is logical. So we talked about an example of substitutes, those hamburgers and hot dogs. Let's take the hot dog piece. What is a good that goes along with hot dogs? Hot dog buns, right? In fact, I can't imagine anybody going to the store and buying hot dog buns without also having or buying hot dogs. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's perfectly legal to do. There's no reason why you can't do it, but people just don't do it, do they? So as a result, they go together. Or hot dogs and mustard, or hot dogs and relish, or something like that. They're used together is logical. That makes sense. Or in maybe in a different part of the world, not as dry as it is here, something like raincoats and umbrellas go together. And so as a result, this has not just a demand side implication, but also a supply side implication. If you know it's going to be a rainy season, then if you're a store, you might want to bulk up on goods which make sense going together, raincoats and umbrellas. And maybe boots if there's a lot of rain, it's muddy or whatever. So you kind of get the idea of substitutes and complements. So a good can be a substitute, but not also a complement. So it's sort of locked in. You're either one or the other. Okay, so if you're a hot dog bun is a complement, but it's not a substitute. You don't say I'm going to have hot dogs, or just buns. It's either hot dogs or hamburgers or hot dogs, which means you also have the buns generally. They go together. And the list of complements that go along with other goods goes on and on and on. As people buy bigger cars, they consume more gasoline. So the consumption of gasoline goes along with the consumption of cars and travel, that sort of thing. Okay. So they kind of go along that particular direction. Okay. Questions for me about that sort of paradigm? I can't see everybody, so I've got to kind of look to see when somebody has entered something in the chat box or whatever. And so I apologize for running out of the camera range there, but it's this is the way that sort of geography of the room is laid out. I can see when people are there. I can see when somebody has posted in chat, but I can't see raise your hand, but I can hear you. So if you have a question, feel free to shout out. Okay. All right, that's the first dichotomous pair. What's the second dichotomous pair that we'll be talking about? And we're going to add a third, but it's going to come later after we get into some other things. And that is normal goods versus inferior goods. Normal goods versus inferior goods. Some of this is not really discussed in these early chapters, and I really wish it would be, because I think it's important, because particularly as we get into chapter 3 next week, demand and supply, I do think it makes a big difference for us to understand, when we're talking about types of goods and what the market responses look like, what the market itself has, what the look and the feel of the market is. Let's talk about normal goods, and there's a reason why they're called normal, and that is because most goods are normal goods. Hence the name, most goods are normal goods. And these are goods, this is the first time we'll really introduce formally the term demand, goods for which the demand is directly correlated with income. Okay, directly or positively, whichever you believe. So whichever you like here. Goods for which the demand is directly correlated with income. And again, this is based upon research. It's not just coincidence that my income has gone up and so I've demanded more of this good, or I and everybody else. It's the fact that we can measure this, and that we can measure the strength of it, and it's both up and down. So if incomes are rising, most goods are normal goods in the sense that as we earn more income, we demand more of these particular goods. And that is, long experiences show that because most goods are normal goods, they respond to income. So if incomes are rising, what is it that we will consume more of as buyers? Remember, we're talking about demand, which is the buy side of the market. What are the kinds of things that we will demand more of? Well, my income's gone up. Maybe I'll buy more clothing, for instance. Maybe I'll buy a bigger car. By buying a bigger car, it means I buy more insurance. I pay more insurance. Or I buy a bigger home. By buying a bigger home, I use more electricity. Maybe I use more water. I once again consume more insurance, right? So, you get the idea. As my income goes up, I demand more of these goods. Also, luxury goods are all normal goods. All luxury goods are normal goods. They're directly correlated with income. And if incomes go down, we tend not to buy luxury goods very much, if at all. So it goes in both directions. As my income falls, I demand less of these normal goods. And we see this happening a lot with, let's just take the two examples of cars and houses with regard to people whose incomes have fallen because they've retired. Or even clothing. I mean, I think all of these examples are pretty relevant to retirees. If you retire, you probably don't buy as many clothes because you don't need clothes for work, and maybe dress clothes or work clothes, that sort of thing. So you buy fewer of those. Maybe you had 3 cars, now you dial it down to 2, or maybe no cars whatsoever. So your income is reduced simply because you're retired. Your income is based upon a pension or Social Security or both or whatever. And maybe you sell the home and move into an apartment or to a much smaller dwelling. And we see this happening all the time. And it simply is a reaction to income. So income is the determinant there. And by the way, we can measure the strength of these relationships with these goods, how responsive these goods are to changes in income through certain measures that we'll get to beginning in chapter, I think it's chapter 5. I think I mentioned that earlier. I think it's chapter 5. Okay, so normal goods are goods for which the demand responds positively to income. So questions about that? Okay, so that's one part of the dichotomous pair. What's the other part? Now, this is sort of an unfortunate term. I probably, if it were up to me, I probably would have chosen a different term for this. But nonetheless, they are. This is the term, and this is just, these are goods which are just the opposite. Goods for which the demand is inversely correlated with income. They're inversely correlated with income. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And the reason I say it's maybe an inferior, or it's an unfortunate term, is because I think a lot of times people have the idea that these goods are qualitatively different than other goods. And that in some cases, I think you can probably make a very strong argument. But then again, when we start naming names as to certain inferior goods, sometimes people say, hey, I like that particular good. Or why are you, looking at me, that sort of thing. So anyway, it is what it is. And so we'll simply go with the term of art that's used here, inferior goods. These are goods which go opposite income. So if incomes are rising, people tend to demand less of these goods. And as incomes are falling, people tend to demand more of them. So think about this. One thing about inferior goods is this, that they are always substitutes for normal goods. And I think that's, if you know this fact, then I think it goes a long way toward understanding what inferior goods really are, that they're substitutes for normal goods. Yeah, what have I done here? I've said we had an inferior good that is a substitute. So again, you're either an inferior good or a normal good, but you can't be both at the same time. You're one or the other, but you're not fenced in here. So you could be an inferior substitute. You can also be a normal substitute for that matter, right? You can also be an inferior complement. So it's kind of like the male, female, smoker, non-smoker. You could be a male smoker or a female non-smoker, right? But you can't be a male and female both, or a smoker and non-smoker both, that sort of thing, right? And I realize that when we talk about gender, it's a little more complicated anymore. And so I'm not trying to get into I'm not trying to enter that particular realm of discussion, other than just simply pointing out what are commonly held examples of opposites, goods which are pairs which are opposite one another. Okay, so when we talk about inferior goods, if we consider the fact that these are always substitutes for normal goods, then we can understand what these are a bit better. So if incomes are falling, then what does demand rise for certain things, for certain goods? What are some examples? Okay, so let's say we're in an economic downturn and people are losing their jobs or getting their hours cut, earning less income, etc. They've got less to spend, so maybe they demand fewer vacations. So as a result, they buy fewer vacations, and maybe they choose some alternative to vacations, such as maybe going to the movies. By the way, the movie business did great guns during the Great Depression. When incomes were falling, the movie industry really took off. Now, part of it was a supply issue where they made the quality and availability better, but people were jamming theaters because they couldn't do any other luxury goods. And they were reasonably priced, and they had this new thing called air conditioning and whatnot. So it was real luxury to be able to do that. But it was a substitute for something else like travel. And travel is still a normal good. So and that's an example of that. Also, during the last economic downturn, not the one that was brought upon by the pandemic, but the last economic downturn, we saw the demand for the normal good, which was going to steakhouses, fall dramatically, and demand for the inferior substitute fast food restaurants do much better. McDonald's did very well, Burger King did very well. People were choosing to take their families to those less expensive restaurants than to the more expensive ones. So that was an inferior substitute. And then when incomes are rising, things are going better, people demand less of those, and they demand more of the normal goods. And so people demand normal goods, all luxury goods are normal goods, and so people return back to normal substitutes for inferior goods. Okay. There are some examples of inferior goods that might not even appear to be that way. And one of these is alcoholic beverages, which are an inferior substitute for other sorts of luxuries. And we have definitely seen a correlation between the consumption of alcohol during economic downturns, that they go in the same direction. So people's incomes are falling during economic downturns, but yet they consume more alcohol. And we have certainly seen this during the pandemic, during the recession. The pandemic has complicated things a little bit because people are stuck at home, and so maybe they're kind of bored and they're looking for anything that they can do that doesn't involve going out. So maybe that's a little bit more complicated. But if we combine that particular experience with longer run historical experience, where during economic downturns, bars do well, liquor stores do well, then we see that there's an inverse relationship between income and consumption of these goods. And so as a result, we do see that happening. And by the way, when incomes are rising, demand for those goods tends to fall. And I recall in the 1980s, when the economy was doing very, very well, there was a lot of talk about trouble in the liquor industry because people weren't consuming as much alcohol. And so as a result, we know that these are inferior goods because of that, the strength of that relationship. Also, cosmetics are an inferior good. This is something that completely seems like a luxury good to some. But it was I think one of the big think it was Estee Lauder herself who said that basically the best thing for the business was a downturn because people bought more cosmetics. Was it a substitute for something? It must have been, and who knows what, but that's one example. It does not always come to mind. But we can measure the strength of that through what's known as income elasticity, and I wouldn't write that term down just yet because we will get to that a bit later as we get going. So, okay. So these are the two couplings of dichotomous pairs at this point that we should talk about. So we're going to have another pair a bit later when we get a little deeper into the class. We have a little bit more background so we can talk about government's involvement in the economy, because so far to this point, for a very long point in this class, we'll be talking about the production of goods. The production of these goods as being mostly a private sector endeavor, done by firms as the key agent, then households supplying the key input, which is labor. Okay. All right. So having said all this, let's sort of shift gears here. I'm going to go ahead and erase this, and if there's any part of this that you didn't get, we have the beauty of rewind. And so if you're watching it live, you can always go back and watch it later. And if most of you are apparently watching it on the replay, you can obviously get into this at some point at your leisure and stop and start. And that's kind of a nice thing. It's something that probably, it seems a little bit unbelievable that colleges haven't done this before now, that we can start and stop a lecture so that you, if you did miss it for whatever reason, a flat tire or whatever, dog stole your keys, whatever, you could get to class, you could follow along in this direction. Okay. All right. So we talked a bit about the who's with the factors, or with the circular flow model of the households, business, firms, and government. We talked a bit about the what's in terms of goods and different types of goods. We're going to talk a little bit now about the how, and we're going to talk about inputs and outputs. And this is a very, very basic model of production. You can't get much easier than this. We talk about what is the production process and what is the idea of creating value. And this is not a particularly brilliant flow chart here. It's not going to win any Nobel Prizes, but it's simply, it will allow us to sort of gauge and diagram what's going on. We have, what do business firms do? This is the key agency is the level of firms. That firms are responsible for production. And I realize that if you are an individual, you can make a particular product, you can sell a particular product in a market. In other words, you're creating outputs for sale that are measured in a market. And that makes you a firm, essentially. In fact, we recognize you as a firm, both in economics as well as the accounting world, and certainly the tax world, because you would pay tax on that, presumably, or are supposed to at least. So that would make you a firm. So a firm can be, it does not have to be some gigantic conglomerate with multiple offices worldwide. You can be any size of a firm, but the key thing is you're producing something, whether it's a good or a service, doesn't matter, and the goods come out as an output. In other words, the goods are what we call outputs. And all these guys here are all the disparate factors that are sort of rounded up as inputs and sort of cobbled together in some sort of collection to make the production process happen. And it can involve things like labor and materials, and it can involve things like energy. I mean, it can involve a lot of different things. It obviously can differ depending upon what kind of good is being produced, good or service is being produced. All those are sort of run through the hopper of the production process. Well, let's talk about inputs a bit here. Outputs we're going to talk quite a lot about. Those are some of the goods which are produced. And we sort of categorize those goods based upon the couple of those dichotomous pairs. I want to talk about production. I don't believe your book, I didn't find it at least, unless it's maybe in a later chapter and I just didn't stumble across it or forgot from my previous use of this text. I do want to talk about this idea of input factors, which if you were to Google this term, it might be referred to as something called factors of production. Factors of production. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about taking all these disparate factors and categorizing them based upon common characteristics. And these common characteristics that allow us to get a feel for where inputs come from, how they're used, and how they can be managed as an independent variable in the production process in order to produce the outputs, which are what are exchanged for value. So factors of production, and factors of production might be the old school term for it. Today we simply call this primarily input factors. And there are four categories of this. There were three, and so from the very beginning, this goes back really to the very beginning of economic thinking, economic writing, and whatnot, the 18th century, and they were land, labor, and capital. And sometime in the late 20th century, there was a fourth one added that was simply known as entrepreneurial ability. Entrepreneurial ability, and we're going to talk about a bit about what that is. And I suspect that fourth category got introduced because there was a recognition, particularly that it's not just these items here of physical substance, but there's also sort of a human element and an X factor, if you like, that has got to be brought to the table in order to have any kind of valuable output being produced. And then without it, there doesn't exist any point in talking about any of these factors of production. Some would think that maybe 4 belongs under number 2, but nonetheless, we'll go with what tends to be the most easily categorizable. So we talk about land again. The first 3, land, labor, capital, these are really old school terms going back a couple hundred years at least. And so when we talk about land, we're not talking about land, only land per se. What we're really talking about is natural resources. Natural resources. In other words, these are inputs that come to us by virtue of our being on the same planet as them. And it's simply a matter of our corralling those natural resources in order to use them. And they don't even have to come from the land. They can be, wind power. They can be hydropower from waters and waterfall, that sort of thing, right? So natural resources, and the examples of these go on and on and on. And so when we talk about some examples of these natural resources, we ought to probably, since we're going back in time here a bit, we can talk about the fact that anthropologists will talk about transitions that happen over very, very long time periods with humans, where some of the things that we had dealt with in our environment became something else. And as wildlife became something different, where growing plants became crops and certain animals became livestock. And it's only a fraction of all the plants are edible to us as crops, and only a certain fraction of the animal kingdom is able to be shepherded by us as livestock. But nonetheless, they do exist. And so when we talk about wildlife, we can talk about things like growing crops. Those are natural resources, obviously, that we have to corral. And the growing crops then become grains, corn, wheat, soybeans, all that kind of thing. So growing crops, also things like livestock. So plants become growing crops. Some plants become growing crops. Some animals become livestock. But there's also a lot of other things as well that are not necessarily, that we don't have to husband in that particular way. That would include things like timber. Timber can become paper, it can become lumber. So timber can become lumber, lumber can become houses. So you get the idea that these are the raw materials for other things, just like livestock, like hogs can become pork, which can become pork chops, right? So you get the idea of these becoming natural resources that work their way into as inputs into some final good. So timber can also include things like minerals. I know a lot of times people's minds will go to things like oil, and that would be considered a mineral, right? Oil, natural gas, coal, all the various kinds of minerals that are out there, copper, all that go into the particular picture to make some particular goods. Also things like sources of energy, like sunlight, right? This is something that is becoming more and more prominent in the creation of electricity. Electricity being an output in its own right, but also input in the production. Because we said energy was oftentimes an input, well, we can categorize that as a natural resource. Electricity, in fact, is a natural resource. We have electrical charges within our body and whatnot. If someone's heart is stopped, we oftentimes because of the breakage of connection, the electrical connection. And I'm certainly no medical expert, but I know that restoring the electrical charge is important in order to restore life in this particular case. So light energy and can create energy in its own right, create electricity, hydropower, so using water or hydropower. Also wind power. These are all natural resources, so they don't really, we don't have to create them. They come to us by virtue of our being on the same planet. But you know, this idea of plants and growing crops, animals and livestock, and then wind power, they all come to us by virtue of our being on the planet together. There are probably a lot of others that I'm missing here, but those I think are probably the key ones there. So we talk about land, we're talking about natural resources. Okay, what about labor? This sounds like it might be pretty obvious, and I think probably for the longest time in economics, the idea of labor was pretty much self-explanatory. The measurement of it was self-explanatory. If you hire 15 people to work 8 hours, then that's 15 times 8. That's what is that? 120 hours worked times X wages. How much they produce, what's the value of what they produced, etc. It was pretty straightforward. All labor was treated as a commoditized input. That is, all labor was basically treated the same. And the wages were considered to be more or less the same, even if they were not. But that was the idea of labor as being simply people showing up. Well, today I think that we're way beyond that stage in our understanding of how labor works. But today we would use the term human capital as a better descriptor of what we're talking about. Human capital is a term that's been around maybe 60-some years. I believe it was one of President Kennedy's economic advisors who first talked about the term human capital. And what human capital is basically the idea of people not showing up, but bringing other things with them as attributes to the table. Now, I want to sort of take a bit of a segue here because it looks like we have maybe a bit of confusion because we have the word capital here and the human capital. So what are we really talking about? We talk about capital. Because the word capital is used in so many different contexts, in so many different uses by different people at different times and whatnot. So what can we say about capital? What is the definition of capital? And then we need one that is a catch-all definition that could be used in any circumstance and it can apply. And then if we want to be more descriptive about just what kind of capital, we can on our own do that. But what is a generic definition for capital? It's anything which can be built upon to produce future value. Okay, anything which can be built upon to produce future value. And then certainly the third category here, capital, we'll talk about how that definitely is the meets that definition, but also human capital meets that definition as well. So anything which can be built upon to produce future value, in other words, to capitalize on it. So business earnings can be considered capital. If they retain some earnings, it's because they're said to capitalize their earnings, to build upon those earnings to produce additional future value. Now that we're in the depths of football playoffs, we hear oftentimes a team will recover a ball and a fumble, and then eventually can do nothing with the ball. So the announcers will say they failed to capitalize. In other words, they failed to build upon what they had to produce future value. So they failed to capitalize. So as a result, capital is anything which can be built upon to produce future value. So what are we talking about when we talk about human capital, which is different from this, which is more physical capital? Human capital is basically this. What are some examples of human capital? In other words, I said at the outset here that it's more than simply people showing up. One of the things that firms, as buyers of labor, are looking for in order to purchase that labor. They're looking for things like skills, people who are able to do certain things. So skills, and the more skills one has, the more marketable one can be in the market. If you're selling labor, that is, you're providing labor, the supply side of the labor market. So right now I'm supplying labor. I've been trained to teach economics, and so that's what I'm doing right now, using the skills, but also my experience. Having done this for a while, so my experience. Now, the one thing about experience that is interesting and sort of maddening at times is the idea that employers, as consumers of labor, oftentimes are looking to hire somebody, they often say experience required. And this leads to sort of a catch-22 where someone will say, well, how do I get experience if nobody will hire me? Because the reason nobody will hire me is because I don't have experience. And that's a tough nut to crack. And I think that the answer to that question is you simply have to work your way in and at some entry level, and then be able to show your employee you can do things. And oftentimes it's an on-the-job sort of thing. And that's really where experience comes from. Isn't that the definition of experience, on the job sort of experience, working your way into being able to do certain things, even jobs you weren't initially hired to do. And that's what leads then to the improvements in human capital, which, by the way, leads to improvements in wages and productivity. There's been a long connection between wages and productivity. That is, the more productive you are, the higher wages you get. And if going back to the football example, now we're seeing lots of criticism of very highly paid football players who have failed to produce the required results. And so as a result, there's a lot of questions as to why they're being paid. Should they be jettisoned from the team, that sort of thing. So you kind of get that idea. Using one's experience to produce value. Okay, so skills and experience. Another aspect of this, which is different, is education. Education is a little bit more formal than experience. It tends to be, it doesn't have to be a college or university setting necessarily. It can come from some sort of trade setting. We certainly have those available at CNN. We have all kinds of occupational and skill-related education for all kinds of vocations. I mean, it's just probably more than any other community college that I'm familiar with. We just have so many different outlets for people to get education in order to do all kinds of things, in high tech, in healthcare, in construction, in truck driving, in cosmetology. And it just goes on and on and on. The opportunities that are available because of that. So anyway, it's not my job to sort of promote the college here. I'm just simply saying that would be an example of that. And I bring it up as a distinction between that and training, which is more on the job. Training is usually job specific. And when I say job specific, I'm talking about that job specific. And if you migrate eventually to some other job because you've gotten some experience, then your training is more on the job for other sorts of things. You've sort of migrated that direction. One thing about experience too, and that's, and I think this is such an important one, and this is why employers value it so much, is the fact that there's really a big difference between someone who's got experience and someone who doesn't have experience. I mean, there really is a huge difference in the sense that people can do things that inexperienced people cannot do. And the thing about it is, you really can't teach it. You can't really teach experience, and you really can't train experience that well. You can train people and say, okay, if something like this happens, maybe it'll happen once in 10 years. This is what you do, right? I know I trained in banking right out of college. I did the management training program in banking, and they talked about all these kind of scenarios that might happen where somebody might try to steal an elderly person's money. And so you'd be on the lookout for that. But if you haven't seen it before, you may not know the look and feel of it. It could just simply be somebody taking an older relative to the bank to make a withdrawal because that older relative doesn't drive, maybe doesn't see very well, maybe needs a little bit of help writing his or her name and whatnot. And that's a big difference between, and knowing that, having experience to know what's what, whether that's just a legit thing or whether it truly is some sort of nefarious activity, simply requires experience that can't be taught in school, and it can only barely be taught in training. So experience is important. It's people having done things, having been there and done that. And like my mother was an attorney for a lot of years, and when she retired, she was doing mostly work in estate planning, probating people's wills, that sort of thing. And it's a fairly specialized area of the law that for law firms specialize. And her firm did mostly criminal law, but she sort of got out of that, did mostly wills and probates. And so her old partners would call her a lot of times saying, hey, what do we do about this? How do we argue this? How do we file this? What's the relevant statute that would deal with this? Simply because they couldn't find it. They really wanted her experience. It can't be taught. It doesn't come in a bottle. You have to have it. So human capital, all these things that people bring to work, and not just showing up. They have to have this, and it makes them more productive workers. And so labor then increases its productivity. And we will talk much more about the connection between labor and productivity very soon as we get going a little bit deeper into this. So this is a pretty good stopping point. Now we talk about human capital. When we come back on Monday, we'll talk about capital as being a different kind of capital, physical capital. And then we'll talk about the final one here, this sort of X factor, entrepreneurial ability. And then we're going to go on to talk about one more model of output. That's basically the how. So we talked about the who's and the what's, And we'll talk a bit about the hows and the whys a bit more. And then we'll get into chapter 3, which deals with supply and demand, which is really then getting us into the heart of microeconomics. So questions for me about anything at this point as we're wrapping up? Okay, well, feel free to get with me anytime over the weekend. I'm available, and I'll be posting the link to this sometime, hopefully later today, Wednesday. And but stay in touch if you do have questions for me. And otherwise, have a great weekend. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for letting me in the class.
Yeah, no problem.